First Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And let's just for continuity's sake back up to verse 14. We kind of got started there, but got rudely interrupted about verse 16 last time. So be able to understand that text, we'll back up a little bit. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 14. Before we jump into that part of the text, any questions, comments about what we've studied so far? Anything that we've left uncovered or unsaid? All right. If not, then we'll pick up at chapter 10, verse 14. What we don't know is Paul dealing with an issue? We know that in this section, starting in chapter 7, Paul is dealing with issues that they had written to him about. Chapter 7, concerning the things of which you wrote to me. And then again, it's our understanding that then when he says concerning in chapter 8 and other places, that's just an abbreviation, that this is just a list of things that the church at Corinth had said, hey, Paul, we need help, we've got questions, and now Paul is writing back and addressing. And so, again, we're reading letters we found in Grandma's attic, and which puts us at a disadvantage. We weren't alive when those things happened, and we're just reading one side of the communication. And so we have to do a little bit of detective work sometimes. And so what we don't know in chapter 10, verse 14, where he's going to talk about fleeing from idolatry, avoiding idolatrous practices, is that a question that they had asked of him? And now Paul is addressing it like he did the other issues in this section. Or is Paul assuming, and Paul often would do this, assuming misunderstandings or objections about something else that he said? And in chapter 8, remember, he had talked about the idea of eating meats that either had been or might have been sacrificed to idols. And what was Paul's summation of that issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols? What did Paul say about that?
As long as it doesn't offend.
Okay. Generally speaking, in a vacuum, nothing wrong with it. There may become something wrong with it if it offends someone else. And so we have to forego some of our rights. So many principles that we can learn, kind of second and third layer principles here. And that's one of them, that you can do something right in the wrong way. We usually, I know I'm a black and white kind of person. This is wrong, this is right. Keep it simple. I don't have the most complex of brains to think. Just keep it simple. And there's a lot of issues that are that way, aren't they? This is good. It's always good. Every time you do it, it's good. This is bad. Anytime you do it, it's bad. There's no excuses for it. But when we realize the nuances, if we can use that word, that sometimes even that which is good can become bad if we abuse that thing. And so he's dealt with that in chapter 8, that it's okay to eat meat, even meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol. And so is it Paul saying, now, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying it's okay to worship idols. You can see somebody that maybe wanted to could take that and say, see, Paul said it was okay. We can go to the temple and worship idols. And so maybe Paul is addressing that possible misunderstanding, possible objection to his teaching, and now is dealing directly with the idea of idols. It really doesn't matter what prompted the discussion. The discussion itself, stands by itself. So he says, therefore, since there is temptation and you need to be wary of that temptation, don't think. And so, what this makes me think that this is just a counterbalance to what he said earlier. You can do that. We know that an idol's not anything. He said that already. But don't become so arrogant that you think you're not susceptible to those practices. And so he says, therefore, since Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall, since temptation is out there, but God's given you a way of escape. Therefore, flee from idolatry. There's your way of escape. We talked about that concept before last Sunday, but here's this idea of flee. We can take that in two different ways, can't we? Literal and figurative. Figurative, it just means avoid it. Don't go where idolatry is. Those practices, don't think just because you're a Christian and you're spiritually minded and you've been baptized and partaken of the Lord's Supper, all those issues he talked about earlier in chapter 10, that you're not susceptible to that temptation. You are. And so flee from that, avoid that. But then we talked about that sometimes maybe it may be literal. Just get away from it. Run from it. That's literally what the word flee means. Run away from it. Go to the other side of the street. Don't flirt with that temptation. There's a whole sermon there, isn't it? That how many times have we fallen because we thought we could get right to the edge? Well, this isn't sinful, and so see, I can get. God said I can get right here, and Paul is saying, look, no, that's not the approach to see how close to sin you can get without giving in to temptation. The proper approach is get as far away from it as you can. So flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. We would say, you know this. You know this. I shouldn't have to tell you this. You're wise enough. Judge for yourselves what I say. And so you're smart enough to figure this out. And so let me go through it. And I trust that with your wisdom, you'll see the light on this. And so here's his wisdom, verse 16. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? Now, what cup is he talking about here? It's not a trick question. What cup that is the communion of the blood of Christ? Okay, the cup of the Lord's Supper. And we talked about this, but the cup, we need to understand, and some misunderstand this. The cup is not talking about the container. The cup is talking about the contents. That's a figure of speech. You don't drink this cup, Jesus said. Well, you don't really drink a cup, do you? It's a figure of speech. Drink what's in the cup, the contents. And so, what he's talking about here is the cup is not symbolic of the blood of Christ. It's just a container, glass, metal, plastic. It's just a container. It's the contents. And so the cup which we drink or which we bless, it is a sharing in the blood of Christ. So, what he's saying here is that these religious practices have behind them a deeper spiritual meaning. You're not just drinking something. You're not just drinking grape juice. You are communing in the blood of Christ. There is an attachment there. You are attaching yourself. That's what the communion, sharing, fellowship, all those words could be translated. You're partaking in that. You're sharing in that. So it's not just some physical action that you're doing. Adam?
Thinking as far as trying to make even deeper application as far as that goes. Matthew 26:39 was when Christ praying in the garden before his betrayal. Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. The cup is not the cup, but it actually is the cup. The same what he was praying to pass is kind of what the cup represents still and what it is. And so the cup is not the container, but it's what's in the container and what the container means all at the same time. It's kind of a really loaded phrase there.
A lot of metaphors in that. The idea of the cup being what I'm going to have to taste or experience. Yeah. Uh,
Testament when let's see, is against like wrath on the nations, they were going to drink
yeah.
God's wrath. That symbolic. It would be like a big bowl that they had to drink from, which was the wrath that was going to be poured out on them.
Yeah. It's a poetic way of saying you're going to have to experience this. You're going to have to experience that judgment, that punishment. Jesus was going to have to experience the suffering that he did, and we experience the blood of Christ. And so his point here is, and in some sense, he's doing two things. He's talking about the Lord's Supper, but he's just saying, just like in the Lord's Supper, we are actually participating in that. So it is with idolatry. It's not just your body that's involved with worshiping idols, that you're experiencing that, you're attaching yourself to that. And so he's doing two things here. And so the cup of blessing, it's actually a communing. It's not just some cup that we're drinking. He goes on to say, the bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? So again, obviously, he's talking about the Lord's Supper here, that it's actually, again, it's not just the physical act of eating and drinking. You are communing, you're sharing, you're attached to that, is point number one. For we, verse 17, we, that Christians, the church, being many individually, Paul uses this language a lot. We'll use it later in chapter 12 in a different subject about unity, that we're many individuals, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. And so his idea here is of communion and of unity, that something is happening when you partake of the Lord's Supper. It's not just a common meal. In fact, we would argue it's not a meal at all, it's a memorial. And so this isn't just a meal. This is a spiritual thing. You're communing with the body and the blood of Christ, and you're attaching yourself to everybody else who is doing that. There is fellowship in that. Fellowship, kind of what we might call a horizontal fellowship with our brethren, and then a vertical fellowship with the body of Christ. And so again, that we could take this, if we just stop there, we would say that's a good lesson on the Lord's Supper. But again, what he seems to be saying is, just as that's true in the Lord's Supper, then it's also going to be true when you worship an idol. That you're not just going to some building and participating in some activities, you're attaching yourself to that. And there's a spiritual thing that's taking place there. So he says, observe Israel, verse 18, after the flesh, that is, physical nation of Israel. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? And so the animal meat that was sacrificed on the altar, they ate of that. They weren't just eating a cow. They weren't just eating a lamb that had been offering. They were partakers in that sacrifice. Again, physical action, spiritual meaning beneath it, or behind it, maybe is a better way of saying that. What am I saying then? So he's saying, look, when you do these religious activities, they're not just a physical activity, they're a spiritual activity, and you're attached to something. And so now he says in verse 19, well, what's the point, we would say? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything? Or that what's offered to idols is anything? So he said, I'm making a point of comparison between the Old Testament offerings and their partaking of those, the Lord's Supper and us partaking of it, and what happens at an idol's temple. Now, I'm not saying they're the same, but there are some correlations there. And so, am I saying that an idol is anything? No. And so, let's talk just a little bit about idolatry. That we could go back to the Old Testament. We could do a whole study on that, couldn't we? Particularly, I think about deeper in the book of Isaiah. God, through Isaiah, kind of mocks the idea of idolatry. Remember there where he talks about, you go out here and you cut down a tree, and with half of the tree you use it for firewood, and then for a part of the tree you'll make a god out of it. And he just isn't that kind of silly? That you do that, and that you make that. First of all, what was silly about idolatry was, number one, is that you've got it reversed. God made us in his image, but in idolatry we make a god in our image. Most of those gods had some kind of human or animal form to them. when the idols were made. And so you've got that kind of backwards, that you're making something and worshiping it. It makes sense that we worship our Creator, but it doesn't make sense that you worship something you created. If anything, that thing should worship you. Because you're the creator of it. And so that's the silly thing, number one. Silly thing number two is Isaiah, or God through Isaiah would say, that because of that inanimate object, it can't do anything. You're worshiping something, you're worshiping a piece of wood or a piece of metal or a piece of stone. It can't do anything. And so what are you worshiping? That just doesn't make sense at all. And we talked about this briefly before, that remember, in the Ten Commandments, God not only forbade the idea of you making an idol and worshiping some other god, but what was forbidden was making an image that represented the true God. We don't talk about that form of idolatry or relic worship as much, but God was saying, don't make an image of some other God, but don't make an image of me either, because that's not who I am. I'm not some lifeless object that can be represented by metal, stone, or wood. And think about this, in the Old Testament particular, God would sometimes use other things to represent him. But if my study, they were always active things. Moses talked to a bush. What was special about that? What was happening to that bush? It was burning. It was flame. Israel, when they went on that journey, God would go before them in the evenings, at least, as a flaming fire. And so God said, here's something outside of myself that can represent me. But what's the difference between a graven image and fire? Is fire's alive. It's active. It's moving. The cloud, pillar of cloud by day, that's something that's living and moving. It's not just some inanimate. So when God would rarely use something else as a representative for him, it was never just a static, dumb, cold object. It was something that was moving and living and active. And so there's the difference. And so he says, I'm not saying an idol's anything. And so the idea, and one thing we need to understand is idol worshipers understood this. They, sometimes we don't, because we didn't grow up in that culture, that idolatrous culture, and we think about how silly that is. You're worshiping a statue. And more silly than that is a statue that you made or that you went and bought in the marketplace. But those idol worshiping people, they would not really think that image was their God. They thought that image represented their God. That here's Baal. That's not Baal in the corner of my living room. That's just a representation of Baal. But what Isaiah would say, or God through Isaiah would say in those kind of mocking sections about idol worship, is that in some sense that's a perfect representation of that God. Because just like that image, that God can't move, can't hear, can't do anything. And so idol worshipers actually got it exactly right in that regard. You found the perfect representation for Baal, for whatever God, because your God's lifeless, as Elijah proved on Mount Carmel. That image can't hear you, that God can't hear you. That image can't move, that God can't move. And so he's saying that this idol is nothing. Because, number one, it is nothing. It's just a piece of stone or metal. But also because what is behind it is nothing. It represents nothing. It is nothing and it represents nothing. So we're not saying that Paul says that an idol is something and that you're really worshiping an actual God. That was not the fallacy of idolatry, is that you went out here and found another God. Because there are no other really gods. And so we're not arguing that. And so an idol is nothing. What's offered to an idol, therefore, is nothing. You offer nothing to, it's almost a math equation. 0 times whatever is 0. And so whatever you offer to nothing is nothing. It didn't change it in any way. But Now that we've established that point, he says, verse 20, I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And so don't take the leap of saying, well, an idol's nothing, therefore what's offered to an idol is nothing, then I can worship idols because it's nothing. No, you're actually worshiping demons, not God. You're choosing, even if it's something imaginary, you're choosing something that is not God. You're making up a God that is not God, and that's as wrong as well. The things that Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. That's pretty straightforward. And so they're offering it to a nothing, but it's not really a nothing because in some ways, Satan, it seems to me what he's saying, is behind that. And you're participating. So you're participating in this thing that's not real, but it's kind of real because, number one, God said don't do it. It's point number one. But also because that there's some demonic power behind that. Adam?
Equation, they're offering it to the opposite of God. God is all things positive, and they are offering this to a negative. And so by not offering it to the positive, it's obviously the other side of the coin. So it's offering it to the opposite of God.
Yeah. You're at least trying to find another God. And I apologize in advance. I couldn't come up with a better illustration than this, and it's not a pleasant one. But you watch Dateline on television, and here's this man that's arrested because he agreed to meet up with an underage, meet up with a minor. Well, come to find out, that really wasn't a minor ever involved. It was some 48-year-old police officer sitting behind a computer. But you could, so, again, stay with me here. I could see it arguing, wait a minute, I didn't do anything wrong. I wasn't actually talking to a minor, to a child. I wasn't actually meeting up with a child. I was talking to an adult, and I met up with an adult. So what did I do wrong? You can see somebody, and I'm sure it's been tried by lawyers and all that, trying to say, look, he didn't actually do anything wrong. He didn't. There was not a young child on the other end of that computer. There's not really a God behind that graven image. But I think the same principle applies here, that was wrong because you had the intent. You wanted to do that. You thought you were doing that. And that's kind of the same as actually doing it. We see that in our judicial system. And I think that's similar. And again, terrible illustration. I'm sorry. But the idea here, you're not really worshiping Baal because there's no such thing as Baal. But you're still doing it wrong because you thought you were worshiping a God. You chose to worship some God, make some God. So even though it wasn't real, it's still wrong because, again, there's still some demonic power behind that. And so now, step 3, number 20, verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord. That's the Lord's Supper that puts you in contact with Christ. That's what communion fellowship means. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. Now, at face value, he's just saying, look, that's inconsistent. That's hypocritical. You can't go to church on Sunday and then on Monday go to worship an idol. You not see the inconsistency there. So the first point of that is that's just the inconsistency. You can't have it both ways. But it's deeper than that. It's also the idea is he's going to argue that, again, point number one, the most basic part of it, that's just inconsistent. That's just hypocritical of worshiping God and worshiping an idol, which is really worshiping demons. But also he's saying, look, when you did that, when you partook of the Lord's Supper, you were attaching yourself to Christ and Christ to you. And so now, when you go over here and worship this idol, who's with you? Christ. In a sense, again, not in some literal sense, but you have fellowship you've made yourself one with Christ, and by the way, with all these other Christians. And so the point that we get from this, because we look at these sections of Scripture and we think, wait a minute, there's no idol temples in Joplin, at least that I know of. I haven't seen them on Google Maps yet. And so how do I apply this? Well, the application here is to realize that when I sin, when I do something, no man's an island to himself, as the saying goes. That when I'm a Christian and I wear the name of Christ, and when I sin, I am sinning with Christ with me. Again, not in a literal sense. Christ doesn't sin. We understand all of that. He's not contaminated by, but in that at least symbolic sense, he is with me. And when I go do that thing, Christ was with me when I did that thing. But also, I think he's saying that we're one body, that now it affects you. And so, again, I need to think on that deeper level of this. It's not just me being inconsistent, which would be bad enough, worshiping God and then turning around and worshiping a demon, but I'm not just going through the motions of worshiping God. I have fellowship with Christ. I'm attached to Christ. I'm attached to all of my brothers. And when I go to the idol's temple, you're with me. Christ is with me in some sense there. I think you understand that point. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Verse 22. Are we stronger than he? When we participate in these things, we serve God and then want to serve an idol, you're just provoking him to jealousy. Verse 23, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. In other words, could you make some kind of legal manipulative argument that, again, that idol's nothing, and so me going to an idol's temple and going through that worship service is not really anything because there's not an idol there, and secondly, I don't even believe in the idol, and so why can't I go do that kind of thing? And so can you make some argument that it's lawful but it's not helpful? And so whether he's talking about the same practice or whether he's talking about some middle ground here that could be okay, but might not be helpful or edifying. All things are lawful for me, but all things do not edify or don't build up someone. Yes, Ashley.
Going back to where's your heart at in all of this, and what are you spending your time on? You could come here as many times as the door is open, but what are you doing when your time outside? I think, money isn't inherently bad. It's what you do with it. Using it in a poor manner, it can become an idol. Drugs are the same way, political figures or celebrities, like they're not all inherently bad, but what you do with it in your heart ends up turning it into an idol.
Excellent point, and especially the point about he's talked about the Lord's Supper. Lord's Supper. I mean, we make the argument, don't we, that it has to be done on the first day of the week. That's a Sunday thing. You can't do it on Thursday when and you have to do it in a worship service on a Sunday. And that's absolutely, I would make that same argument. But that Lord's Supper goes with me when I leave the building. Is his point here? That's not just some Sunday thing that I did and I checked that off because I did those 5 acts of worship, check, 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 and now I'm done. No, that Lord's Supper has a deeper spiritual meaning, and it does attach itself to my heart. Let no one, verse 24, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. So don't seek your own interest, your own well-being. Again, can I make some argument that that's lawful? This goes back to chapter 8 here, that I'm not helping someone else. So now we get to the conclusion part. Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. And so you went to the meat market and you were going to encounter 2 different types of meat. Some that had just been slaughtered on the farm and brought to the market to be sold. But also there would be some that had been slaughtered and had gone through as part of the idol worship, but these are the leftovers. And we're going to say, oh, we killed 5 cows and we only used 4, and so take that 5th one out of the temple and down to the marketplace. Waste not, want not, and sell it. And so there's a chance that what you were buying wasn't just slaughtered at the farm by the farmer. It was slaughtered at the idol's temple as a part of their worship service. But again, as he said in chapter 8, that didn't contaminate that meat. And so when you go to the meat market, it's kind of the same today, a little different, not very different today. I used to work in a grocery store, and I used to work in the meat department of a grocery store. It's best that you don't know what happened at the slaughterhouse or in the grocery store. Don't ask. Did that guy over there that's got, canker sores all over him, did he handle that hamburger meat? Did you drop that chicken on the floor and then pick it up and wrap it up, which we did all the time? It's just better that you don't know. Same way with a restaurant. These open kitchens and these fancy restaurants, probably not best that you don't know, in all of that. And so that's the idea about this. Just don't ask. You buy the meat in the marketplace, eat it, don't ask. If you don't know, then it's not going to violate your conscience. Again, not that it was wrong, period. It just might be wrong from conscience sake. For, verse 26, the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. So in other words, that was God's cow before that farmer ever got it. It was God's cow when it went to the idol's temple, and it's God's cow in the marketplace. God provided that to you for food, and so don't think of it that way. Don't think of this as a cow that's been contaminated by an idol, but this is a cow that God created and made it so that we could eat. If any of those who do not believe invites you to dinner, all right, so we're going to get a real hypothetical. How you like that? Real hypothetical situation. You're a Christian, and a non-Christian asks you over for supper, and you want to go. You desire to go. Eat whatever's set before you, asking no question for conscience sake. So again, you go to the marketplace, you go to your neighbor's house to eat. Just don't ask, because again, not that not asking would make something that's wrong right. It's wrong. I mean, it's right to begin with, but it might become wrong for conscience sake, and so it's better for you to just not even ask. But hypothetical situation number 2, verse 28, but if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols. And so I don't know if that's a gotcha moment. The Gentiles invited you over just to do that. And I don't know when they said that. I'll tell you, this is kind of like my grandpa. I think every time I read this verse, I think of my grandpa Duke. My grandpa was a farmer, and when he got older and a little bit more feeble, and I never thought of him as feeble, he's a big, strong guy, but he switched from cows to goats because they were easier to handle. The cows got too much for him to handle and too dangerous, and so he switched to goats because he could handle the goats a little bit easier. And so they always had goat's milk and goats. And Grandpa and my Granny Hazel, you'd go over there and eat, and it wouldn't be till you were done and eating dessert that Grandpa would say, "Did you enjoy that?" And you just knew when he said that, you go, "What was it, Grandpa?" And usually it was okay. That was goat meat you just ate. He'd tell you afterwards, because if he said, he laid that meat down in front of you and said, "This is goat," you might turn up your nose and not eat it. So he'd say after the fact, so I don't know if this is one of those kind of gotcha moment. You know what you just ate? And so if this Gentile says this was offered to idol, do not eat it for the sake of the one who told you. So again, it wouldn't have been wrong on its face to eat that, but if that person is saying it to point out that you don't want to give them the wrong idea that you're okay with worshiping idols. And so again, something that's right can become wrong in the right scenario. And so if somebody says, then don't eat that. Again, it would have been all right to eat it. The meat wasn't spiritually contaminated, but you're sending the wrong signal maybe to that Gentile. So if they say it was offered to idol, do not eat it. Again, not because it would be wrong for you, but for the sake of the one who told you, and for conscience sake. So maybe it would violate, because The whole premise to begin with was don't ask, so that you won't violate your conscience. And so now that you know, you might be going, oh, every bite, every bite, you're thinking that this is goat, this is goat, this is goat. Rather, if you didn't know it, you just think, oh, this is good, this is good, you know. And so there's the difference. Um, for the earth is the Lord and all its fullness. Again, it was a practice that was lawful, it was okay, but it might become wrong. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. Is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? And so the conscience here is not just your own conscience sake, but it's the conscience of someone else. Maybe the Gentile. And here, conscience, I think, is used in a little, just very little bit different than what we think of, if I'm understanding this correctly, because what I don't see in this hypothetical scenario is a Christian that might be offended by this. I only see two parties. Here's a Christian who wouldn't be offended by it, and a Gentile who's not a Christian, is the way I take it. Um, Back up to verse 27, he doesn't just say a Gentile, he says any of those who do not believe. Now, let's be fair to the text. Two ways of interpreting that person. So the person that invited you over to dinner did not believe. Well, what's your first assumption of what that phrase means of one who does not believe? He's not a Christian. I think at face value, most of us would go, okay, here's a non-believer, a non-Christian. But there's another way of interpreting that, isn't there? There's one who does not believe that it's okay to eat meat that might have been sacrificed to an idol. I don't think that's what he means, but we have to be fair to the text and the possibilities that that's what he's talking about. Because, first of all, in this scenario, the reason I don't believe that's the case, some commentators argue that that's what that means. He doesn't believe. He doesn't believe you should eat meat. Well, what's problem with that interpretation? He's the one that fixed the meat. And so, unless this is really a gotcha moment, that he's just like, oh, I don't know if I can even touch this, but I'm gonna catch Larry, and Larry's gonna eat this, and then I'm gonna say, aha, I'm not gonna eat it because it's wrong. But again, I don't think that's the case at all. Here's someone who's not a believer, not a Christian. He's eating this meat, but he knows that you don't believe in idol worship, and so conscience here, when he says, conscience, I say, verse 29, not your own, but that of the other, is not that if here's a Gentile unbeliever, I'm not violating his conscience, really, in the normal sense that we think about violating his conscience, but he has in his mind that this is idol meat. And so when I do that, he can't differentiate that. He thinks I did something wrong. I haven't really violated his conscience. He don't feel bad about it. He things he's doing at the idol temple, this is nothing. And so I haven't really violated his conscience in some moral way, but I've led him to think that, and I've got an illustration for that. But Adam first. No, you go ahead first.
Along with the idea that it's not the gotcha moment, is that, this might be someone, if you desires to go, that they don't know for sure what they're trying to be a good host, and so they're realizing, oh, I better ask. That we've found ourselves in the position. You invite somebody over. So many people have food sensitivities to things today. That, oh, and by the way, I was gonna fix this. Love the recipe, but it's got whatever in it. Can you eat gluten? Can you eat whatever? Can you
Mhm.
because anymore we know so many people that are have problems with something that we don't want. It's not that we don't want to offend them. We don't want to make them have to go to the ER the next day or whatever. That yeah, we can eat it and it's fine, and we know it's our. We tell people sometimes that, okay, we're gonna this meat is venison. This is deer meat. Around here, everybody just well, it's fine.
Yeah.
But there are those that it's Bambi. So, as trying to be a good host to try to serve something that is palatable, will make those caveats ahead of time. That hey, you want to come over for dinner? By the way, we're going to have, deer burgers on, whole wheat bread. If either of those things don't fit for you, then maybe you don't come for lunch. We're having this for dessert, but
Yeah. Let me run with that illustration. So if Adam and Abby invite me over to dinner and say this is venison, and I go, oh, I hate venison. Oh, but let me eat it, and so I eat it, and then Abby says, "Was it? Oh, that was good. That was good. I enjoyed that." What's the danger in that? Now they think I like venison, don't they? And when they come over again, what's they going to serve? Oh, Ken likes venison. We were going to have chicken, but we're going to have venison because Ken's coming over. And so I've given you the wrong impression, haven't I? And so, same way with the idol worshiper. This is idol meat. Oh, hand it over. Well, what does that person think? Thinks Ken's good with idols. And so they, not true, but and so here again, another layer of how something can be wrong. If someone thinks that what I'm doing is wrong, that then it now becomes wrong on some level. Larry?
The section I think Matthew 15, where Jesus said, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." It's hard to carry that verse out when you're in an idol temple whooping it up, even if it's theoretically not wrong. But you're endorsing it. At least you're appearing to endorse it. And here's like, oh, this was sacrificed to Aphrodite. It's delicious.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, I guess that's not doing that.
yeah.
Example to the non-believers that you need to be.
Yeah, they're thinking you're doing that. So here's my illustration, and I tell it two reasons. Number one, maybe to elucidate the point I'm trying to make, but also to evoke sympathy for my poor mother and what she had to deal with me growing up. When I was growing up, I had asthma, and I had to have prescription cough medicine because of that. And I don't know if you're old enough to remember, prescription cough medicine used to come in those dark brown glass bottles. You remember those? Tasted terrible, but I had that cough syrup, and so we had some of those left over, and this was before the days of internet and video games, so you had to come up with something to do. And so I would rinse out those bottles and soak the label off of them and put Kool-Aid in them. A brown glass bottle full of Kool-Aid, and I would go down and stand by the road and wait for somebody to come by and then act like I was drinking whiskey because I was cool. That was, and so they would come by and I would take a little swig off of that Kool-Aid and the cough syrup, thinking I was cool. I was the biggest dork there ever was. I know that. But, and I understand, allow for the child. Nobody thought that was really a whiskey bottle. They knew it was a cough syrup bottle. And what I was, the worst they could think of me is I was drinking cough syrup recreationally. But we can see as an adult, would you want to go get a whiskey bottle and put iced tea in it and then drink that in front of somebody if you wanted to give the impression that you didn't drink? You see the point that there's kind of the idea of you're doing something not wrong. It was Kool-Aid. God's not opposed to me drinking Kool-Aid, but it could become wrong if I'm giving the impression to somebody that I'm doing something that is wrong. And so conscience, another kind of different layer of conscience there that we can violate. So, all right, we'll pick up there next time. Quickly finish chapter 10 and move into the very controversial chapter 11.